This video was made possible with the support of our generous patrons. We can't thank you enough for your kindness. Hello everyone and welcome to another EDH gameplay video brought to you by Affinity for Commander. My name's Martin.
And my name is Alex.
Today we are finally showing off our fancy new camera. Hopefully the upgrade will be noticeable in the quality of the video. So without further ado, let's see those starting hands. My commander is Arcades the Strategist. My opening hand consists of Overgrown Battlement, Wall of Roots, Hover Barrier, Slaughter the Strong, Hazoret's Chancery, Band Panorama and the Plains.
I'm playing Lord Windgrace as my commander. I keep an opening hand of Sylvan Safekeeper, Yavimaya Elder, Farseek, 2 mountains and 2 forests.
Luke's commander is Aminatou the Fate Shifter. His opening hand contains Daxos of Malentis, Geist of the Archives, Magister of Worth, Mystical Tutor, New Benelia, Concealed Courtyard, and Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth.
And finally, Phil is playing Hazoret the Fervent. He keeps an opening hand of Vexing Devil, Seal of Fire, Outpost Siege, Mutavault, and 3 mountains.
Luke wins the die roll and starts things off by playing New Benelia. He keeps the top card of his library where it is and passes to Alex.
I play a forest and then cast Sylvan Safekeeper before passing the turn.
I play Plains and end my turn.
Phil plays a mountain and then casts Vexing Devil. I choose to take 4 damage to have Phil sacrifice the devil, and Phil then passes to Luke.
Luke plays Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth. He then casts Demir Signet and passes the turn.
I play a mountain and then cast Farseek. Martin responds by cycling Ash Barrens to put a forest into his hand, and I put a swamp into play. Moving to combat, I attack Phil with my Safekeeper, dealing him 1 damage. I then pass to Martin.
I play a forest and then cast Overgrown Battlements. I then end my turn.
In his turn, Phil casts Seal of Fire. He then plays a very shiny Mutavault, and then passes the turn.
Luke plays Reliquary Tower, and then casts Daxos of Malentis. He then passes to Alex.
I begin my turn by casting Tireless Tracker. I then play a forest, make a clue, and then end my turn.
I play an island and then cast my commander, Arcades the Strategist. I then pass the turn, to which Phil responds by sacrificing his seal to deal 2 damage to Alex's Tireless Tracker. Alex responds by sacrificing a swamp to his Safekeeper to give his tracker hexproof, and Phil then moves to his turn.
Phil plays a mountain and then casts Grim Lavamancer. He then ends his turn.
Luke plays Concealed Courtyard and then casts Oars of Signet. Moving to combat, Luke attacks me with Daxos. I take 2 damage and exile Beast Within from the top of my library. Luke gains 3 life and then casts the spell targeting Tireless Tracker. Alex decides not to sacrifice another land and creates a 3/3 beast to replace his Clue Producer. Luke then passes the turn.
In my turn, I cast Yavimaya Elder, play a forest, and then pass to Martin.
I start my turn by casting Hover Barrier, drawing a card thanks to Arcades. I then tap my battlements to add 2 mana to my mana pool and use it to cast Wall of Roots, drawing once more. Next I play Hazoret's Chancery, returning a Plains to my hand, and then move to combat. I attack Alex with Arcades, dealing him 3 damage, and then end my turn.
Phil plays a mountain, and then casts Outpost Siege, naming cards. He then passes to Luke.
Luke wastes no time in his turn and casts Magister of Worth. We tie for votes and the board is wiped except for the angel herself. Yavimaya's Elder's ability resolves and Alex puts a swamp and a mountain into his hand, and Luke then ends his turn.
I play a swamp and then cast my commander, Lord Windgrace. I use his +2 ability, discarding a mountain to draw 2 cards, and then pass the turn.
I cast Gatecreeper Vine, putting a forest into my hand. I then cast Jeskai Barricade, choosing not to bounce my Gatecreeper to my hand. Next I play Selesnya Sanctuary, returning a forest to my hand and then pass to Phil.
In his upkeep, Phil exiles Flame of the Blood Hand with his Outpost Siege. He then casts a spell to deal 4 damage to Windgrace, plays a mountain, and ends his turn.
Luke begins his turn by casting Yannette, Cryptic Sovereign. He then moves to combat, attacking Windgrace with his Angel. Windgrace's loyalty hits 0, and Luke passes to Alex.
I play a forest, and sacrifice my clue to draw a card. I then cast Realms Uncharted, revealing Temple of the False God, Cabal Coffers, Golgari Rot Farm, and Rakdos Canarium. Phil puts the 2 bounce lands into my hand and the temple and coffers into my graveyard. Next I play Traverse the Ulvenwald with Delirium. I put Wayward Swordtooth into my hand, discard down to 7, and then end my turn.
I play a forest and then recast Arcades. Moving to combat, I attack Alex with Gatecreeper Vine and Phil with Disgaea Barrier. Phil responds by cycling Smouldering Crater, then takes 2 damage and Alex takes 4. I then pass to Phil.
Phil exiles Thermo Alchemist with Outpost Siege, and then cycles Desert of the Fervent. He plays a mountain and casts Thermo Alchemist, followed by Gitu Lava Runner. He then passes the turn.
Luke plays Shambling Vent and then moves to combat. He attacks me with Yannette and responds to her trigger by casting Mystical Tutor. Luke puts Temporal Trespass on top of his library, which he then casts with Yannette's ability. I then take 3 damage from the Sphinx and Luke moves to his second turn.
For his second turn, Luke plays Submerged Boneyard. He then casts Enigma Sphinx, cascading into Wormcoil Engine. Luke then moves to combat, attacking me with Yannette. He reveals Azorius Signet as being on top of his library and draws it, and I take 3 damage. Luke then ends his turn.
Alex starts his turn by casting Wayward Swordtooth. He then plays Rakdos Canarium, returning a forest to his hand, and immediately replays the forest. Next Alex casts Sylvan Ranger, searching his library for a forest and puts it into his hand. He then passes to me.
Martin plays a Plains, and then casts Slaughter the Strong. Phil and Martin sacrifice nothing. Luke sacrifices everything except for Yannette, creating 2 3/3 worms thanks to Wormcoil Engine, and I sacrifice my Wayward Swordtooth. Luke puts Enigma Sphinx 3rd from the top of his library, and Martin then moves to combat, where he attacks Luke with all of his creatures. Before blockers are declared, Martin casts Swords to Plowshares, exiling Yannette. Luke gains 3 life and blocks the barricade with his Death Touch Worm and the Gate Creeper with his Lifelink Worm. Both of Martin's walls are destroyed, as is Luke's Death Touch Worm, and the damage dealt by Arcades is cancelled out by Luke's life gain. In his post-combat main phase, Martin casts Wall of Mulch, drawing a card. He then passes to Phil.
Phil exiles Exquisite Firecraft with his Outpost, and then deals 1 damage to everyone other than himself with Thermo Alchemist. He then plays a mountain, and then casts the exiled Firecraft, destroying my Wall of Mulch. Thermo Alchemist untaps, and Phil casts his commander, Hazoret the Fervent. Phil then ends his turn.
In his turn, Luke casts Azorius Signet. He then casts Brilliant Ultimatum, revealing Ponder, Gideon's Intervention, Emrakul the Promised End, Enigma Sphinx, and Counterspell. Martin puts Emrakul and Counterspell into one pile and the other 3 into the second. Luke takes a pile of 3, casts Enigma Sphinx, and cascades into Cataclysmic Gearhulk. Phil responds to the Gearhulk's trigger by dealing everybody other than himself 1 damage, and then sacrifices the Alchemist and his Lava Runner. Luke sacrifices 2 Signets and his Worm, not needing to sacrifice his Sphinx as it is still on the stack. Next, Luke casts Ponder, shuffling his library and draws a card. Still not finished, Luke casts Gideon's Intervention, naming Arcades the Strategist. Martin cries, and Luke passes to me.
Alex begins his turn by casting Rampaging Baloths. He then plays a forest, makes a 4/4 beast, and passes the turn.
Martin casts Wall of Tanglecord and draws a card. He then casts Wall of Frost and draws once more. Moving to combat, Martin attacks Phil with Arcades, dealing him 3 damage. In his second main phase, he plays Bant Panorama and ends his turn.
In his upkeep, Phil exiles a mountain, which he then plays. He then discards a card to activate Hazoret's ability, causing everyone else to lose 2 life. Next, Phil casts Enchanter's Bane, and then moves to combat. He attacks Luke with Hazoret, and Luke blocks the god with his Enigma Sphinx. The Sphinx is put 3rd from the top of Luke's library, and Phil moves to his end step. Phil targets Gideon's approach with his Enchanter's Bane's ability, and Luke chooses to take 4 damage. Phil then passes the turn.
Luke plays Tranquil Cove, gaining a life. He then casts Mind Stone, followed by Geist of the Archives. Luke then passes to me.
Alex plays a forest, creating another 4/4 beast. He then recasts his commander, using his -3 ability to return Cabal Coffers and Temple of the False God to the battlefield. Alex makes 2 more beasts and moves to combat. He attacks Luke with his Baloth, dealing him 6 damage, and then ends his turn. I respond by sacrificing my Bant Panorama to put an island into play, and then move to my turn.
Martin starts his turn by casting Glacial Wall, drawing a card with Arcades. Next, he plays a Tranquil Cove of his own, gaining life, and then moves to combat. He attacks me with Arcades, Wall of Tangle Cord, and Wall of Frost, and I block the former with my Ranger, and the latter with 2 beasts. Martin responds by casting Tower Defense, giving his walls an extra 5 toughness. I take 3 damage from the Elder Dragon, all of my blockers are destroyed, and Martin passes the turn. Phil responds by discarding a card to Hazoret, everyone else loses 2 life, and then Phil moves to his turn.
Phil exiles Chaos Warp with his outpost, and then casts Scab Clan Berserker. He then casts Chaos Warp, shuffling Alex's Rampaging Baloth into his library, and replacing it with Nissa, Vital Force. Moving to combat, Phil attacks Nissa with Hazoret, and me with his Berserker. Alex blocks with a beast, and I declare no blockers, taking 2 damage. The Berserker's Renown ability triggers, and Phil puts a +1/+1 counter on it before moving to his end step. He targets Gideon's Intervention with his Enchanter's Bane trigger, and Luke responds by sacrificing his Mind Stone, drawing a card. He then sacrifices the enchantment, and then proceeds to his turn.
In his turn, Luke plays a Swamp, and then casts Enigma Sphinx once more. He cascades into Brainstorm, which he casts, taking 2 damage from Scab Clan Berserker. Luke then passes the turn.
Alex begins his turn by activating Windgrace's +2 ability, discarding a land to draw 2 cards. He then adds 11 black mana to his mana pool with Cabal Coffers, casts Borborygmus Enraged, and then uses Nissa's -3 ability to return Tyler's Tracker to his hand. Alex then casts the tracker, plays Savage Lands, and makes a clue. He then passes to me.
Martin plays a Forest, and then moves to combat. He attacks me with Glacial Wall, and Phil with all of his other creatures. Phil animates his Mutavault to block Wall of Frost, and I sacrifice my clue to draw a card, and put a +1/+1 counter on my Tireless Tracker. I block Glacial Wall with my Beast, and Phil takes 9 damage. Martin then ends his turn.
In his upkeep, Phil exiles Curse of the Pierced Heart. He then casts Wheel of Fortune, and Luke responds by cycling Lonely Sandbar. Alex then discards a mountain and a forest to Borborygmus to deal Luke's Gearhulk 6 damage, and then discards a further 2 lands to deal my Wall of Tanglecord 6 damage. I then cast Rapid Hybridization, taking 2 damage from Phil's Berserker and destroying Borborygmus. Alex is compensated with a 3/3 Frog Lizard, and Wheel of Fortune resolves. Phil then plays Mishra's Factory and casts Electrostatic Field before moving to his end step. He targets Enchanter's Bane with its own ability, taking 2 damage, and then passes to Luke.
Luke scries away the top card of his library with his Geist, and then casts Hostage Taker. He exiles Tireless Tracker, which he then casts. Luke then plays Meandering River, and Tireless Tracker's ability triggers. Phil responds to the trigger by casting Tarfire on the tracker, and everyone else loses a life to Electrostatic Field. Tireless Tracker dies, and Luke makes a clue, which he instantly sacrifices to draw a card. Luke then ends his turn.
Alex uses Cabal Coffers to add 12 black mana to his mana pool. He then casts Obnixilis the Fallen, followed by Splendid Reclamation. Oh dear. Alex takes 2 damage from Phil's Berserker, and Phil responds by casting Molten Influence. Everyone else takes 1 damage, and Alex lets the spell deal him 4 damage to prevent his Reclamation from being countered. Splendid Reclamation then resolves, and Alex returns 8 lands to the battlefield from his graveyard. He deals 18 damage to Phil, knocking him out of the game, and the remaining 6 to Luke. Alex returns a mountain to his hand as a result of his Golgari Rotfarm's ability, before putting 24 +1/+1 counters on Obnixilis. Still not finished, Alex uses Nissa's +1 ability to untap his coffers, making it a 5/5 elemental until his next turn. He then casts Scapeshift, sacrificing 15 lands to put 15 lands into play from his library. Obnixilis then deals lethal damage to both Luke and myself, winning the game for Alex. Well, that was certainly a flashy victory. We hope that you enjoyed it as much as we did. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Also, feel free to follow us on Twitter @4Commander, and consider supporting us on Patreon. Links in the description. We'll see you next time.